The day is done. Let the stillness settle as we journey back through the corridors of time. Somewhere, in the long, slow turning of history, there is a man standing at the edge of a river. The water is black and thick with ice. The wind is merciless. The men behind him are starving, hollow-eyed, wrapped in rags. And yet, he does not turn back. What kind of man stands at such a crossing and chooses to go forward? In the 18th century, the American colonies simmered beneath the iron hand of the British crown. For generations, men and women had crossed the Atlantic to build something new, something fragile, something worth protecting. They had cleared forests, raised families, and paid their taxes. But as the 1700s wore on, the crown grew heavier. The Stamp Act, the Townshend Acts, soldiers billeted in private homes, taxation without a single voice in Parliament. Slowly, a quiet rage began to build along the eastern seaboard, from Boston to Philadelphia, from Virginia to the Carolina lowlands. And out of that rage, a revolution was born. At the center of it stood one man. He commanded an army with no uniforms, no pay, and sometimes no shoes. He crossed a frozen river on Christmas night to save a dying cause. He defeated the greatest military power on earth, not by outfighting them, but by outlasting them. And when it was finally over, when every other general in history would have reached for a crown, he handed back his sword. He went home. His name was George Washington. Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army in 1775. First President of the United States. The man who, when his country called him again, answered once more, presiding over the Constitutional Convention, establishing the office of President, and then walking away from power a second time. The world had never seen anything like it. Tonight we follow him from the very beginning. From a modest Virginia farm where a boy lost his father too young. From the untamed Shenandoah Valley, where a teenager with a compass learned to read the land. Through the blood of the French and Indian War, the frozen crossings, the desperate sieges, and the candlelit halls of a newborn nation learning to govern itself. This is the story of George Washington, surveyor, soldier, general, president, and the most reluctant, most essential founder of them all. Let his story carry you gently into the quiet dark. Suggest topics for new videos in the comments and subscribe to the channel. Sleep Stories, Sleep Dream are released here every day. Close your eyes and let the world go quiet around you. There is no hurry here, no noise, only the slow, steady breath of history, drifting toward you like wood smoke on a cold Virginia morning. Tonight we begin at the beginning, not with trumpets or proclamations, not with marble statues or the weight of legend. We begin in the red clay soil of the Tidewater region, in a modest farmhouse on the banks of the Potomac River, where, on the 22nd of February, 1732, a boy named George Washington took his first breath. The world he entered was not grand. It was practical and demanding. His father, Augustine Washington, was a planter of modest ambitions, a man who worked the Virginia earth, operated an iron furnace, and moved his family across the colony in search of better land. The family settled at a farm called Ferry Farm near the quiet town of Fredericksburg. It was here that young George spent his most formative early years, listening to the river, watching the seasons change, learning the rhythms of the land, but the land offers no guarantees. In the spring of 1743, when George was only 11 years old, his father fell gravely ill. Augustine died in April, leaving behind a widow, several children, and a divided estate. George was not the eldest son. The larger inheritance passed to his half-brothers Lawrence and Augustine, the younger. George received Ferry Farm, a modest sum, and 10 enslaved people. Enough to begin. Not enough to guarantee anything. With his father gone, George's formal education ended. The small schooling he had received, arithmetic, some reading, the rudiments of a colonial curriculum, came to an abrupt close. There would be no English university, as his half-brothers had attended. What George Washington would learn, he would learn from the land itself, from surveying chains and compasses, from frozen rivers and enemy fire. He was 11 years old, fatherless and quietly, completely, on his own in the years that followed. George grew close to his eldest half-brother, Lawrence. Lawrence Washington was 14 years older. A veteran soldier, a man of military bearing, married into the powerful Fairfax family. He had built a handsome estate on the Potomac he named Mount Vernon. George visited often, absorbed everything. The Fairfax connection opened doors that a fatherless Virginia farmer's son could never have opened. Alone, it was through. The Fairfax family that George found his first real. Profession. Lord Thomas Fairfax owned more than 5 million acres stretching across northern Virginia and into the unmapped Shenandoah Valley. In 1748, when George was just 16 years old, he was invited to join a surveying expedition into that wilderness. He went with a notebook, a compass, and a hunger to prove himself that never quite left him. The Shenandoah Valley was not tamed country. It was dense forest and rushing streams, limestone outcroppings and sudden ravines, and settlers pushing westward, building lives on the very edge of the British frontier. George rode into this landscape on horseback, crossed the Shenandoah River by canoe, slept wrapped in a thin blanket beside fires that barely held back the cold. But he learned to read the land, the way other boys learned to read books. To sight along a chain, to calculate a bearing, to record the contours of a hillside in careful, measured notation. He developed an eye for terrain that would serve him many years later in ways he could not yet imagine. By 1749, Washington was appointed the official surveyor of Culpeper County, one of the youngest men to hold such a post in Virginia. He was 17 years old. Over the next 3 years, he conducted more than 190 surveys. He mapped the wilderness with a precision that earned him genuine respect and a reliable income. He bought land of his own. He was learning not just to read the land, but to own it, accumulate it, turn raw frontier into something lasting. And then, in 1752, Lawrence died. Lawrence had been ill for some time with tuberculosis. He traveled to Barbados in a desperate attempt to recover, taking George with him on that voyage, the only time in his life George Washington would ever leave the North American continent. The warm air did not save Lawrence. He died in July of 1752. He was 34 years old. George inherited the lease on Mount Vernon, and within a few years its full ownership. He was 20 years old, suddenly the master of a working plantation of 2,500 acres on the Potomac. enslaved workers in the fields, crops to manage, buildings to maintain, a life to build. He threw himself into it with characteristic discipline. He studied farming texts from England. He diversified his crops, shifting away from the exhausting tobacco monoculture that wore out Virginia's soil toward wheat and other grains. He expanded the mansion house. He managed his finances with a methodical care that became a lifelong habit. Mount Vernon under his hand began to grow into something remarkable. But the frontier was not done with him. In the early 1750s, the Ohio Valley had become a flashpoint. The French were pushing south from Canada, building a chain of forts through the interior, claiming territory the British also believed their own. Virginia's lieutenant governor, Robert Dinwiddie, needed someone to carry a stern diplomatic warning deep into that wilderness to the French commanders. He chose George Washington. In October of 1753. Washington set out from Williamsburg with a small party in a country already turning bitter with approaching winter. He crossed dense forest, swollen rivers, met with Iroquois leaders whose alliance was uncertain. He reached Fort Le Boeuf in what is now northwestern Pennsylvania, delivered Dinwiddie's ultimatum to the French commander, who received it politely and declined to leave. Washington returned with the French refusal and with careful notes on their fortifications, their numbers, their supply lines. He was 21 years old and had already demonstrated something rare at any age: the ability to move through danger with steadiness, observe clearly, and report accurately. The following spring, 1754, Washington led a small militia force back into the Ohio Valley. At a place called Jumonville Glen, his troops ambushed a French scouting party, killing 10 men, including their commander. It was arguably the first shot of what would become a world war. The French and Indian War had begun, and George Washington had fired its opening volley. He fell back to a hastily constructed stockade he named Fort Necessity. The French counterattacked in overwhelming force. Outnumbered and driving rain with ammunition soaked and men exhausted, Washington was forced to surrender, the only formal military surrender of his life. He signed the Articles of Capitulation on the 4th of July, 1754, before he could know the strange weight that date would one day carry. He was permitted to march his men out with the honors of war. The following year brought catastrophe at the Monongahela. In the summer of 1755. The British General Edward Braddock led an expedition of 1,400 regular soldiers toward Fort Duquesne. At the forks of the Ohio River, Washington rode as a volunteer aide-de-camp. On the 9th of July, within a few miles of the fort, the column was suddenly violently ambushed by French regulars and their native allies firing from concealed positions in the forest. The British regulars, trained for open field battle, broke apart. They could not see their attackers. They fired in panicked volleys at shadows in the smoke. Braddock rode among them and was shot from his horse, mortally wounded. The column dissolved into desperate chaos. Washington, who had been riding on a pillow only days before due to a severe fever, threw himself into the carnage. He rode back and forth across the killing ground, rallying men, carrying Braddock's orders. 2 horses were shot from under him. 4 musket balls passed through his coat without finding flesh. He was not touched. He organized the retreat, helped carry the dying Braddock from the field, turning a rout into something that at least resembled withdrawal. Braddock died 4 days later. He was buried in the road, so the retreating column would march over his grave and obliterate it. Hiding it from the French. Washington emerged from the disaster with his reputation not just intact, but elevated. His courage was spoken of across Virginia and beyond. He was 23 years old and had already survived things that would have broken older, more cautious men. He returned to Mount Vernon. He married in 1759 a wealthy widow named Martha Dandridge Custis, a warm and steady woman who brought 2 young children and a substantial estate into their union. He took his seat in the Virginia House of Burgesses. He managed his lands, his crops, his careful accounts. For 15 years he was, by any measure, a man at peace with his world. But the world was not finished with George Washington. It never was. Rest now. Let the Virginia soil hold you gently. Let the river move quietly past the dark trees. The story has only just begun. The years passed quietly at Mount Vernon. Slowly, steadily, the river moved. The seasons turned. George Washington was 40 years old, then 41, then 42. A gentleman farmer, a member of the Virginia House of Burgesses, seated among men who believed with genuine conviction that they were Englishmen entitled to the full rights of Englishmen. For a time, that belief seemed enough, but something was changing. Something slow and irreversible, the way a river changes course, not in a single violent flood, but grain by grain, season by season, until one morning the water runs somewhere it has never run before. What turns a loyal subject into a revolutionary? What moves a man who has fought under the British flag, who has dined with British officers, who has admired British discipline and order? What moves such a man to the edge of open defiance? It was not one thing. It was never one thing. It was the Stamp Act of 1765, which taxed the very paper on which colonial life was written, legal documents, newspapers, even playing cards. The sense of insult was greater than the financial burden. Parliament, 3,000 miles away, felt entitled to reach into the pockets of men who had no voice, no seat, no vote, no recourse. Washington wrote of it plainly. He called it unconstitutional overreach. He said it quietly, but he said it. The Townshend Acts followed in 1767, laying duties on glass, paper, paint, and tea. Washington's response was methodical. He reduced his own dependence on British imported goods. He wore Virginia-made cloth. He encouraged his neighbors to do the same. He was not yet a rebel, but he was already a man quietly building the scaffolding of resistance. And then came December of 1773. In Boston Harbor, men disguised as Mohawk warriors threw 342 chests of East India Company tea into the black water of the harbor. Washington heard the news. He disapproved of the destruction of private property, but he understood, with the clarity of a man who reads terrain, that something had shifted and could not be shifted back. Parliament responded with the coercive acts of 1774, measures so severe that colonists called them the intolerable acts. Boston's port was closed. Massachusetts' self-governance was suspended. The message from London was unmistakable: obedience or punishment. Washington attended the First Continental Congress in Philadelphia in September of 1774. He sat and listened and said relatively little in formal sessions, as was his nature. but he told Patrick Henry and others in private that he would raise 1,000 men at his own expense and march them to the relief of Boston if it came to that. He was not boasting. He was simply stating what he had already decided. He returned to Virginia. He began drilling local militias. He was preparing, though not yet certain, for what? On April 19th, 1775, British regulars marched toward Lexington and Concord to seize colonial militia arms. Armed men were waiting. Shots were fired. The war, which had been gathering in the air like a storm for a decade, had arrived. The Second Continental Congress convened in Philadelphia in May of 1775. Washington arrived in his military uniform, the blue and buff of the Virginia militia, and took his seat. He did not wear that uniform by accident. A man of Washington's deliberate nature does nothing by accident. The uniform was a statement, quiet and unmistakable. He was ready. He understood what the moment required. He spoke little in formal debates. He served on military committees. He watched and listened with those pale, steady eyes and that quality of absolute, unhurried attention that men found both reassuring and formidable. John Adams had already determined that the commander of the new Continental military force must be a Virginian, to present the cause as a pan-colonial effort, and because the most qualified man happened to be Virginia's own. On June 14, 1775, Congress voted to establish a Continental Army. The following morning, Adams rose and formally nominated George Washington of Virginia as Commander-in-Chief of all forces raised and to be raised for the defense of American liberty. The vote was unanimous. Washington addressed the Congress in a voice that carried the faintest tremor, not of fear, but of the weight of what he had accepted. He said he did not consider himself equal to the command. He would exert every faculty he owned in the service of the cause. Then he declined any salary, asking only that his expenses be carefully recorded. He wrote to Martha from Philadelphia, and the letter is one of the quieter heartbreaks in the historical record. He told her he had not sought the appointment. He told her it had been given by unanimous consent. He told her he could not, with honor, refuse. He arrived in Cambridge, Massachusetts, on July 3rd to find an army in name only. Perhaps 14,000 men encamped around Boston, where the British had been penned in since Lexington and Concord. The militias were brave, but they were not an army. Not yet. They were organized by colony, loyal to their own colony's officers, accustomed to electing their own commanders, and deeply suspicious of military discipline. They camped where they liked. They left when they felt like leaving. There were almost no sanitary facilities, almost no standardization of weapons or drill, and a desperate shortage of gunpowder so severe that when Washington learned the true numbers, he fell into a silence that those present found alarming. He did not despair, or if he did not permit others to see it. He set to work with the same methodical patience he had brought to Mount Vernon, only now the crop was an army, and the soil was composed of free men who had to be persuaded rather than commanded. He established regular drill. He imposed basic sanitation. He wrote letter after letter to Congress, requesting supplies, cannon, clothing, blankets, receiving in return a fraction of what he asked for, accompanied by expressions of great sympathy. The siege of Boston settled into a stalemate through the autumn and winter. And then Henry Knox arrived. Knox was 25 years old, enormously large, and had read every military book he could find in his Boston bookshop before the war closed it. He had proposed, with cheerful audacity, to haul captured British cannon from Fort Ticonderoga, 300 miles away, across frozen mountains in the dead of winter, and deliver them to Washington. He departed in December of 1775 and returned in January of 1776 with 59 pieces of heavy artillery, transported on sleds pulled by oxen across frozen lakes and mountain passes, through blizzards, over rivers where the ice was barely thick enough to hold. Washington now had cannon, and he had a plan. Dorchester Heights was a low promontory overlooking Boston Harbor. Whoever held it with artillery commanded the harbor and made Boston untenable for the British fleet. But to fortify, it required speed above all. The earthworks had to be completed in a single night before the British could respond. On the night of March 4th, 1776, under a brilliant moon, Washington's men moved silently up the heights. They had spent weeks prefabricating wooden frames, filling them with pressed hay to absorb cannon fire, constructing fortifications in sections that could be assembled quickly. 3,000 men worked through the night in near complete silence. By dawn, the heights were fortified with Knox's artillery pointing directly down into Boston Harbor. British General Howe looked up at Dorchester Heights and reportedly said that the rebels had done more in one night than his entire army could have done in a month. He prepared a counterattack. A fierce nor'easter intervened, making any harbor crossing impossible. When the storm cleared, the heights were even more heavily fortified. Howe made his calculation. To dislodge Washington's artillery would require a frontal assault against an entrenched position with every advantage of elevation, exactly the assault the British had made at Bunker Hill. At devastating cost, he was not willing to pay that price again. On March 17th, 1776, the British fleet and army evacuated Boston. They sailed away to Halifax. The city was freed without a single engagement, without a single life lost in the final confrontation, through meticulous preparation, audacious planning, and one night's silent, disciplined, miraculous work on a moonlit hill above the harbor. Washington rode into Boston the following day to church bells and cheering crowds. He had been in command for 8 months. He had not won a pitched battle. What he had done was harder. He had created from almost nothing the conditions that made victory possible. He had held an army together. He had made it into something that could endure. He was 44 years old. The war was barely beginning. Rest now. Let the cold Massachusetts air settle around you. Let the harbor lie quiet in the darkness below the heights. The cannon are in place. The army endures, and the long road ahead stretches onward through hardship and cold rivers yet to cross. The story is not finished. It has only found its footing. The city of New York sprawled along the southern tip of Manhattan, its harbor wide and open. Washington knew the city was indefensible. He said so quietly to his generals. The harbor invited fleets. The shorelines invited landings. And yet Congress wanted it held. And so Washington, who had learned at Boston that the measure of command is sometimes knowing which battles cannot be won, prepared to fight for a city he could not keep. The British came in force. General William Howe arrived with the largest expeditionary force Britain had ever assembled. Nearly 32,000 soldiers, professional men trained for war. supported by a fleet of over 400 ships. Washington could muster perhaps 19,000 men, many of them militia, many of them sick, most of them untested against regular infantry in open battle. What happens when a general of will and steadiness meets the full weight of the British Empire? The answer came quickly. On the 27th of August, 1776, the Battle of Long Island began. The British moved with devastating efficiency. General Howe sent a column swinging wide through an unguarded pass in the dark hours before dawn. By the time the flanking column struck from behind, the American line was already breaking. Nearly 1,500 Americans were killed, wounded, or captured in a single morning. General William Alexander, known as Lord Stirling, led a desperate rear-guard charge to buy time for others to escape, and was himself taken prisoner. Washington stood at the edge of that battlefield and watched his army come undone. He was 44 years old. He had spent a year building something fragile and hard-won. Now it was breaking apart on a Tuesday morning in August. What does a commander do when the situation is already lost? He preserves what can be preserved. That night, and into the following morning, Washington organized one of the most extraordinary evacuations of the century. Under cover of darkness, and then by the extraordinary fortune of a thick, concealing fog that held through the early hours, he ferried nearly 9,000 men across the East River in silence. Boats moved without torches. Men boarded without speaking. By the time the fog lifted, the American army was gone, but Manhattan was no safer. The British landed at Kip's Bay on the 15th of September, and the militia there broke and ran before a proper exchange of fire had begun. Washington rode toward the collapse, furious, trying to rally men who had already decided the ground behind them was safer. An aide finally seized his bridle and drew him away. Fort Washington fell on the 16th of November. 2,800 American soldiers surrendered in a single afternoon, the single largest loss of the entire war. Washington watched from the far bank of the Hudson River. He said later that he felt something tear inside him as he watched. Then came the retreat across New Jersey. It is difficult now, from a distance of centuries, to feel what that march truly was. It was not a strategic withdrawal. It was a flight. Washington's remaining force moved south through New Jersey, with the British pressing behind them, never far enough back to allow a full night of sleep. Some citizens had already arranged their accommodations with British rule. The roads were frozen mud, and the nights were getting colder. The army shrank as it walked. Enlistments expired, and men went home without ceremony. Militiamen slipped away in the gray hours before dawn, taking their blankets and their justifications with them. By the time Washington crossed the Delaware River into Pennsylvania in early December, he could count fewer than 3,000 men capable of bearing arms. 3,000 against an empire that had not decided to stop. Thomas Paine was with the army in those cold, contracting weeks. He sat by firelight and wrote the words that would become the American crisis. These are the times that try men's souls. He was not writing for history. He was writing for the men shivering in the dark around him, for the men considering the long road home. Washington had the pamphlet read aloud to his troops. It was perhaps the only thing he had left to give them that did not require a supply wagon. What drives a man to continue when every rational measure says the cause is finished? December of 1776 gave Washington nothing but cold evidence of ruin. Congress had fled Philadelphia. The Delaware River was the last thin barrier between the British advance and the extinction of the revolutionary government. And then Washington made the decision. He would cross back on the night of the 25th of December, 1776, in darkness and sleet and a driving, bitter wind. Washington began moving his army across the ice-choked Delaware. The operation on the water was commanded by Colonel John Glover and his Massachusetts fishermen and sailors, the same steady men who had managed the evacuation from Brooklyn in August. The boats were Durham boats, long and flat, built for hauling iron ore. The river was full of moving ice, great grinding slabs that pressed against the hulls, and every crossing was a calculation of weight and current and chance. The crossing was supposed to be complete by midnight. It was not. The storm intensified. The ice thickened. Men waited in columns on the Pennsylvania bank for hours, unable to go forward and unwilling to turn back. Henry Knox, the bookseller turned artillerist, managed the crossing of 18 field pieces over a river in a blizzard, hauling them onto the boats with ropes and sheer will. He accomplished it because Washington needed it accomplished, and because Knox had learned that necessity invents what preparation cannot dot by 3 in the morning, the army was across. The crossing had taken 9 hours. The march to Trenton was 9 more miles through snow and darkness broken only by the lanterns of officers. 2 men froze to death on the road. Washington rode up and down the column through the night, speaking to men by name when he knew them. Those who survived that march and lived long enough to speak of it said the same thing. He did not seem cold. In the worst of it, he seemed the stillest thing in the world. The Hessian garrison at Trenton was commanded by Colonel Johann Rall, a capable officer who had grown too comfortable in the assumption that the American army was finished. His troops had spent Christmas the way soldiers spend holidays when they believe the war is effectively over. Rall had received intelligence that morning of possible American movement and had not acted on it. The weather, the season, the apparent ruin of the Continental Army, all of it suggested that nothing could arrive from the far bank on Christmas. Night. Washington struck at dawn on the 26th of December. His columns approached from 2 directions simultaneously, driving into Trenton before the garrison could properly form. The battle lasted less than an hour. Colonel Rall was mortally wounded. Nearly 900 Hessian soldiers were captured. The Continental Army lost 2 men to wounds and none to enemy fire. It was not a large battle by the measure of centuries, but it was the right battle at the right moment when the revolution needed proof, not a theory of proof, but the actual fact of it, that it could still strike. The news moved through the colonies like fire through dry grass. Men who had been deciding whether to accommodate the British reconsidered their arithmetic. Washington had asked his soldiers personally to extend their enlistments by 6 weeks beyond their expiring terms. He had no money to pay them. He told them the truth, that he needed them, that the cause needed them. A remarkable number of them stayed. He was not finished. On the 3rd of January, 1777, Washington struck again at Princeton, meeting British forces on a frozen farm road in the early morning. The battle turned uncertain when the American line began to buckle. Washington rode forward into the open ground between the 2 armies, within easy range of musket fire from both sides. Those with him turned their faces away, unable to watch. When they looked back, he was still on his horse, upright and steady, and the American line had steadied around him. The British formation broke. Princeton was taken dot in 10 days. Washington had crossed an ice-choked river in a blizzard, destroyed a Hessian garrison at dawn, and defeated a British force in open battle. He had given the Revolution the one thing it could not survive without: time. Time and the demonstrable knowledge that the cause was still alive. The British withdrew from much of New Jersey. General Howe retired into winter quarters and reconsidered the assumption that this war would be short. Washington led his diminished, enduring army into the hills around Morristown to wait out the cold. He was 44 years old. He had retreated 400 miles. He had crossed a river in a blizzard on Christmas night. He had won when the world had stopped expecting him to rest now. Let the Delaware settle back into its slow, dark current. Let the fires of the Trenton encampment burn down to coals. The men are sleeping on frozen ground. The cannon stand cold in the fields. And somewhere behind them, on the road from the river, the footprints of an army that refused to stop have already been covered by new snow, leaving nothing but the quiet, stubborn fact of what was done here and what it cost, and why it mattered. The story is not finished. It is only refused again to end. There is a valley in Pennsylvania 19 miles northwest of Philadelphia, where low ridges flank a slow, dark creek, and the fields go empty and white in December. In the winter of 1777, 11,000 men marched into that valley and began to die, not quickly, not in battle. They died slowly, the way cold and hunger always work, patiently, without urgency, taking a man in pieces before taking him whole. Valley Forge. The name would come to mean endurance, stripped of everything except the bare, essential fact of still being alive. But in those first weeks it meant frostbitten feet wrapped in rags, men leaving bloody footprints in the snow. A commissary so empty that soldiers went 3 or 4 days without meat and sometimes without bread. Washington rode through the camp and saw it plainly. He always saw things plainly. He wrote to Congress in the unsparing language of a man who has looked at something terrible and refused to look away. He described men without clothing to cover their nakedness, without blankets to lie on, without shoes, feet and legs frozen against the ground. He was 45 years old, 2.5 years into a war that had cost more than anyone had planned for, and he was watching his army dissolve around him like ice in a slow thaw. The huts went up, 12 feet by 16 log walls chinked with mud, 6 or 8 men to a structure, a single fireplace that smoked more than it warmed. 2,000 huts built by men who had almost nothing left, a raw frozen city carved out of the Pennsylvania wilderness. Typhus moved through the encampment. Dysentery. Pneumonia. By February, close to 4,000 men were sick or unfit for duty. Of the 11,000 who had arrived, perhaps 2,500 would die at Valley Forge before spring. Not killed by a British musket, but by the cold arithmetic of an undersupplied war, and yet Washington stayed. He did not retreat to a warm house in the countryside. He did not ride south to press Congress in person, though his letters to that body were relentless and precise and increasingly urgent in tone. He stayed in a stone house at the edge of the encampment and was seen each morning, walking the lines, speaking to the men in the low, measured tones that were described as steady, Even when there was nothing steady about the world around them, his presence was a kind of argument. It said, "I have not left. I have not decided this is finished. I am here in the cold with you." Martha came in February. She organized sewing circles among the officers' wives to make clothes and patch uniforms. She was small and capable and entirely without drama, and the men responded to her with something close to reverence. But it was a man who had crossed the Atlantic, who would reshape the army itself. Friedrich Wilhelm August Heinrich Ferdinand von Steuben had served as an officer in the Prussian army. He was not, as he had claimed, a lieutenant general. He was a captain. What he brought to Valley Forge in February of 1778 was not rank, but knowledge. Specifically the knowledge of how to turn a crowd of armed men into a functioning military unit. He spoke almost no English. He communicated through a translator, and when the right phrase could not be found, von Steuben resorted to French and, it was said, to magnificent profanity in several languages simultaneously, which the men found enormously entertaining. He did not hold this against them. He understood that American soldiers were not serfs. They needed to know why. They needed to understand the purpose behind each command. And so he told them why he began with a model company of 100 men on the parade ground in the freezing mud, the manual of arms, the platoon fire, the bayonet charge executed together, in unison, like a single organism rather than a scramble of individuals. He wrote his drill manual in French each night and had it translated into English by morning. He revised as he watched, and he watched everything. It worked. Within weeks, the model company could execute movements that had been impossible for the Continental Army. The knowledge spread as trained men trained others. By the time the Army marched out of Valley Forge in June of 1778, it was something different from what had arrived in December. It could move, wheel, and fire in sequence. It had become, for the first time, an actual Army. In May came the news that France had formally entered the war as an American ally. Washington ordered a feu de joie. A running volley of musket fire passed down the line from one end to the other, like a long rolling wave of sound. Men cheered. Some wept. The world had changed. France had recognized the United States as a sovereign nation and committed its navy, its treasury, and its professional army to the cause. The war grew broader, slower, and more deliberate. Washington fought at Monmouth in June of 1778, a battle that demonstrated for the first time that the Continental Army could stand and trade, fire with British regulars in open field without dissolving. He was on the field constantly, a large man on a large horse, moving through smoke and heat, reforming a line that had begun to break. The following years were years of grinding endurance. 1779, 1780. There were mutinies over unpaid wages and expired enlistments. Washington addressed what was just and enforced what was necessary. He understood the grievances were real. He also understood that an army unable to hold its own order could not hold anyone else's ground. Then in the summer of 1781, the strategic picture changed. Completely, a French fleet under Admiral de Grasse was sailing toward the Chesapeake. The British General Cornwallis had positioned his army at a small tobacco port on a Virginia peninsula between the York and James rivers. The place was called Yorktown. Washington saw the possibility with the same cold clarity he had always brought to the ground before him. He saw the trap, if it could be closed in time. He and the French General Rochambeau marched 700 miles south, deceiving the British commander in New York about their movements until they were already gone. The young French General Lafayette was already in Virginia, watching Cornwallis, holding the line. Supply depots were arranged along the route through New Jersey, through Philadelphia, through Maryland, down into Virginia. On the 5th of September, 1781, the French fleet met the British fleet at the Battle of the Chesapeake. The British withdrew to New York for repairs. The bay became French water. Cornwallis was cut off from the sea, from reinforcement, from escape. The trap had closed behind him with the quiet finality of a door in a dark room. Washington arrived at Yorktown on the 14th of September and assessed the fortifications. He had a professional French siege train, experienced engineering officers, an army shaped at Valley Forge, and for the first time in the war, a clear numerical advantage, 17,000 Allied troops against roughly 8,000 inside the British lines. The bombardment opened on the 9th of October and did not stop. On the 14th of October, 2 key redoubts were taken in coordinated night assaults. The Americans under Alexander Hamilton moving silently through. The dark until silence became speed, and speed became the possession of the earthworks. Cornwallis asked for a ceasefire on the 17th of October. On the 19th of October, 1781, the British Army marched out to surrender. Their band played a tune witnesses recalled as the world turned upside down. Washington stood at the ceremony and watched. He was 49 years old. He had commanded the Continental Army for 6 years and 4 months. He had retreated more miles than he had advanced and lost more engagements than he had won by any narrow accounting. And he had won the only thing that finally mattered. Cornwallis claimed illness and sent a deputy to offer the sword. That deputy first approached the French commander Rochambeau, as if hoping to soften the symbolism of the surrender. Rochambeau directed him to Washington. Washington directed him to General Benjamin Lincoln, who had himself been forced to surrender at Charleston the year before. Lincoln received the sword. The accounting of dignity was settled without rancor and without haste. The war was not legally finished. British troops would remain in New York until 1783, and 2 more years of negotiation would follow. But everyone present at Yorktown understood what had happened. The major British field army in America was gone. Parliament, exhausted by years of cost and inconclusive result, would not send another. The Revolution had survived its winters. It had survived the retreats and the empty wagons and the months of frozen suffering in a Pennsylvania valley, where men left blood in the snow and asked of the earth only that it hold them one more day. It had survived because it had a general who did not know how to accept finality, who looked at what remained after every reduction and said quietly, steadily, "This is enough. Let us see what this is enough for. Let the cannon cool now. Let the trenches at Yorktown fill slowly with autumn leaves. The British are marching out beneath the white flag. There is a man on horseback at the edge of the field, not celebrating loudly, watching carefully, as he has always watched, as if the day is not quite done, as if there is still one more thing to attend to before he will permit it to be over. He is 49 years old. The war has aged him past easy counting. And it is finished. The story is not finished. But this part, written in cold and blood and the stubborn refusal to stop, that part has found its end. And it was enough. There is a moment in the life of a man who has held great power, when he must decide what that power was ever truly for. Most men who reach such a moment find reasons to hold on. They discover new emergencies, new necessities, new arguments for why the work is not yet complete. History is crowded with such men. It is nearly empty of the other kind. On the 23rd of December, 1783, in the Great Hall of the Maryland State House in Annapolis, George Washington walked into a room full of watching eyes and did something the watching world had not believed possible. He gave it all back. He was 51 years old. He stood before the Continental Congress in his uniform, the same uniform that had carried him through 8 years of brutal, uncertain war. He held in his hands the commission that had made him the most powerful man in America, and he surrendered it quietly. His hands, witnesses noted, were trembling. What does it mean when the most powerful general on the continent trembles at the moment of victory? It means he understood what he was holding. He knew that every gesture a man in his position makes becomes a template. Every choice becomes a precedent. He was not simply resigning a commission. He was writing the first sentence of a definition of what American power was meant to be. King George III of England had reportedly asked his American painter, Benjamin West, what Washington would do after winning the war. West replied that it was said he would return to his farm. The king was silent a moment. Then he said, "If he does that, he will be the greatest man in the world." He did that. The carriage that carried him south from Annapolis moved through the December countryside toward a place he had been aching to see for years, Mount Vernon. He arrived on Christmas Eve, 1783, and walked through his own door into the smell of wood smoke and his wife's voice, and for a small, suspended moment the war was truly over. The years that followed were the years he had imagined from 100 frozen campsites. He rose before dawn and rode the boundaries of his 5 farms, all 8,000 acres of Virginia soil. He experimented with new crop rotations, moving away from exhausted tobacco toward wheat, which fed people rather than feeding a distant market's appetite for luxury. He designed a new barn. He read books on scientific agriculture by firelight. He was, in the truest and most literal sense, trying to build something that would last, but there were letters arriving with the books. Letters from men he trusted, men like James Madison and Alexander Hamilton, containing a drumbeat of alarm that grew louder through 1784 and 1785. The Confederation of States was coming apart. States imposed tariffs on each other's goods. War debts went unpaid. Veterans who had bled at Valley Forge were losing their farms to creditors, while Congress could raise no revenue to help them. And in the winter of 1786, a Massachusetts farmer named Daniel Shays led an armed uprising of debtors against the courts, and the federal government could do nothing, because it had no army and no money and no real power to act. Washington sat at his writing desk at Mount Vernon and read the letters and felt something close to despair. He had not crossed the Delaware in a blizzard and buried men in Pennsylvania snow so that the Republic could die quietly of administrative dysfunction within 5 years of its birth. He agreed to go to Philadelphia. The Constitutional Convention opened in May of 1787, and Washington arrived to find himself unanimously elected president of the convention before deliberations had properly begun. He took the chair at the front of the hall in the Pennsylvania State House, the same building where independence had been declared 11 years before, and proceeded to do something that required particular restraint. He presided without dominating. He spoke almost nothing during 4 months of debate. He listened. He maintained order. He sat in the high-backed chair in his Virginia planter's coat, and by his mere presence he conferred a gravity and legitimacy on the proceedings that nothing else could have provided. The delegates argued about representation, about slavery, about executive power, about whether a central government with real authority was a necessity or a monster. Washington watched and waited and moved the process forward quietly, through personal trust rather than public argument. The document that emerged in September of 1787 was not perfect. Every man who signed it knew it was not perfect, but it was something that could be made to work, which is not the same thing as perfect and is often more valuable. When the signing was done, Benjamin Franklin, 81 years old and carried into the room in a sedan chair, looked at the carved sun on the back of the presiding chair and said he had wondered throughout the convention whether it was a rising or a setting sun. Now, at last, he said he knew it was rising. Washington returned to Mount Vernon and waited. He knew what was coming, and he did not want it. The letters he wrote to friends in this period are not the letters of false modesty. They are the letters of a man who genuinely loved his farm and his river and his quiet mornings, and understood, with unhappy precision, that those things were about to end. The electors cast their votes in February of 1789. Every single one of them, 69 electors from the states that had ratified the Constitution, wrote the same name. It had never happened before. It has never happened since. He was elected President of the United States without a single dissenting voice, and the weight of that unanimity was not a comfort. It was a responsibility so large it had no edges he could find. He was 57 years old when he left Mount Vernon on the 14th of April, 1789, riding north toward New York. The journey became something no one had planned, a continuous procession of celebration, crowds gathering at every town and bridge and crossroads to watch him pass. He wrote to a friend that the display of affection moved him and also terrified him, because the expectations being projected onto him were expectations no single man could fully meet. The inauguration was on the 30th of April, 1789. He stood on the balcony of Federal Hall in a suit of American-made brown broadcloth, a deliberate statement that the new nation could clothe its own leaders from its own looms. He took the oath of office and added at the end the words "So help me God," though no one had written them into the script. Then he went inside and delivered the first inaugural address in American history, and his voice was trembling again. Everything he did now was a first. There was no manual. There was no predecessor. When he walked into a room, the question of how everyone should behave had no answer yet, because the answer was being invented in real time by whatever he chose to do. He spent weeks debating with Madison and others how formal his public appearances should be, how to be the head of a republic without resembling a king so closely that the entire experiment was self-defeating. He settled on weekly levees open to respectable visitors, conducted with dignity, but without the bowing and kneeling that European courts demanded. He was to be called simply Mr. President. He built his cabinet from the finest and most combustible materials available. Thomas Jefferson became Secretary of State, brilliant and distrustful of centralized power, devoted to the idea that the Republic's strength lay in its farmers and its states. Alexander Hamilton became Secretary of the Treasury, equally brilliant, and devoted to precisely the opposite idea that the Republic's survival depended on a strong central government, a funded national debt, and commercial development. These two men, both indispensable, both serving the same president, disagreed with the focused intensity of men who understood that their conflict was philosophical and could not be resolved by dinner and goodwill alone. Washington tried, for years, to hold the center between them. Hamilton's financial program moved through Congress over. Jefferson sustained opposition and gave the federal government an actual financial foundation for the first time. When Pennsylvania farmers rose in armed resistance to the whiskey tax in 1794, Washington personally led the militia westward. The only sitting American president ever to command troops in the field, and the rebellion dissolved before a shot was fired because he was there, and his presence carried a weight that argument could not. He was aging visibly now. The hair had gone fully white. The jaw was set in the particular way of a man who has learned to hold pain without showing it. He had lost most of his teeth, and the dentures he wore were a source of constant discomfort that his face rarely admitted. He watched the cabinet splinter and reassemble around the quarrel between Hamilton and Jefferson. He signed the Jay Treaty with Britain in 1795, accepting a compromise that infuriated the Jeffersonians, and was burned in effigy in Philadelphia because he believed it necessary to keep the peace until the Republic was strong enough to survive a war. Through all of it, through the factional fury and the partisan press and the grinding work of building institutions that had never existed before, he kept his eye on the one thing that mattered most, that this experiment should survive long enough to prove it was possible. Not perfect, not painless, possible. That was enough, as it had always been enough. He had learned that somewhere between the Delaware crossing and Yorktown, and he had not unlearned it since. The Republic had survived. That was the first thing. Not cleanly, not without cost, not without the kind of compromise that left a bitter residue in the mouth of every man who had made it. But it had survived. And now, with 2 terms completed and the machinery of government running, however noisily under its own power, George Washington made the decision that would define everything else. He would leave. What makes a man who has held supreme power, who's been called upon again and again by the voice of his countrymen, choose to walk away from it? The answer, if you follow the thread of his life back to its beginning, is not complicated. It was never the power he wanted. It was never the office, the title, the ceremonies. It was the thing those instruments were meant to protect. And once that thing was reasonably secure, there was nothing left to hold him. He announced his intention to retire in the spring of 1796. He would not seek a 3rd term. He had considered leaving after the first, had drafted a farewell then, had consulted Madison about the words, and then remained because the factions were tearing at the fabric of the new government with a ferocity that frightened him. But now he would go. The Republic would have to stand without him, and the only way to prove it could stand without him was to make him leave. He worked on the address throughout that year. He returned to the draft from 1792, the one Madison had helped him shape, and brought it to Hamilton, who reworked the language with the precision of a man who thought in systems. Washington reviewed every line. He was not simply signing his name to another man's prose. He was composing, in collaboration, the most important thing he would ever put before the public. Not a battle order, not a treaty, a letter to a country dot. He released it in September of 1796. He did not read it aloud. He gave it to the newspapers, and the newspapers printed it, and the country read it in parlors and taverns and fields, and what they read was this: a warning, quiet and measured and absolutely clear, against the forces he had watched working to undo the revolution from the inside. He warned against the spirit of party. He had watched Jefferson and Hamilton drag the cabinet into open warfare, had watched men who had stood together at Valley Forge become enemies over the question of which European power was the better ally. He knew parties would form. He knew human nature too well for that illusion. But he urged his countrymen to understand that excessive party spirit would invite demagogues who would exploit divisions they had not created. He was describing something he had already seen. He was warning against it with whatever authority his name still carried. He warned against permanent alliances with foreign nations. He did not say America should isolate herself. He said she should engage the world on her own terms, through commerce and diplomacy, and the cool self-interest that befits a republic with its own purposes. Temporary alliances for extraordinary circumstances. No permanent entanglements that would drag the young nation into the ancient quarrels of European powers. He was not describing weakness. He was describing discipline. He warned against the erosion of public credit and the habit of treating the law as a convenience to be set aside when it conflicted with passion. And then he said farewell. 45 years of service to his country, he noted, with the understatement of a man who had never been comfortable talking about himself. He acknowledged his errors. He asked to be remembered with patience. He was 64 years old. John Adams was elected. Washington attended the inauguration on the 4th of March, 1797, and those who watched him said he looked like a man released. Adams later recalled that Washington whispered something to the effect that he was now in a position Washington had envied. The comment had the quality of truth about it. He returned to Mount Vernon. He had been away from it, in the deepest sense, for 8 years. The estate had not been managed the way he would have managed it, with the eye that walked every field and the hand that wrote every instruction. He set about the work of restoration with the intensity of a man who had been thinking about it for a very long time. He rose before dawn. He ate simply. He rode out through his fields in the morning, inspecting the winter wheat, the cattle, the drainage ditches, the progress of the mill he was rebuilding. He corresponded with agricultural journals and experimented with crop rotation. He entertained visitors because Mount Vernon had become a place of pilgrimage for the new republic, and he received them with the courtesy that had always been second nature to him. He wrote long, careful letters about farming and policy, and his grandchildren and the price of flour. He wrote to Lafayette, who had survived imprisonment in Austria. He wrote to Knox and McHenry, to the men who had stood with him through the long years. He watched the country from a distance and said, mostly, that it was doing as well as could be expected, in 1798. When war with France seemed possible, Adams called him back briefly to accept command of a provisional army. He accepted, though the crisis dissolved before any army was needed. He rode to Philadelphia for consultations, found himself older than the last time he had walked those streets in office, and returned to Mount Vernon. The autumn of 1799 was productive. It was improving his farm, supervising construction, putting his affairs in order. On the 12th of December, he rode out as usual through a cold and worsening day. The rain turned to sleet. He stayed out for hours because the work required it, because he had never been a man to turn back on account of weather. He came in soaked and said nothing of it at dinner. By the following morning, he could barely speak. His throat had closed. He was burning with fever. His doctors came, and what they did was the medicine of the age. They bled him, repeatedly, taking from a man who was already weakening the blood he could not afford to lose. 4 times they bled him. He bore it without complaint. He had borne Braddock's defeat in the winter at Valley Forge and the smallpox and years of campaign and rain and frost. He bore this, too, quietly, without display. On the night of the 14th of December, 1799, he spoke to Christopher Shields, the enslaved man who had attended him throughout the day. He thanked his secretary. He gave instructions about his burial. He told them not to let him be placed in the vault too quickly. And then, in the particular stillness of a cold December night at the house on the Potomac, George Washington died. He was 67 years old. He had been ill for less than 2 days. The country went quiet with it. Congress adjourned. Bells rang from Boston to Savannah. Henry Lee gave the eulogy that produced the phrase that would follow him through history: first in war, first in peace, first in the hearts of his countrymen. Napoleon ordered 10 days of mourning in France. The British fleet flew their colors at half-mast. What he left behind was not simply a country, though a country was itself a considerable thing to leave. He left behind the precedent that the precedent could be set, that a man who held absolute authority in a moment of crisis could choose to return it, that the peaceful transfer of power was not an accident of lucky circumstances, but a decision that a man of sufficient character could make, and make stick, and make twice. He left behind his will, which contained the document his public life had never managed to produce. He freed his enslaved people. Not all of them could be freed immediately. The legal arrangements of a joint estate were complicated, and Martha's dour slaves were not within his power to manumit unilaterally. But his own, the ones he owned outright, were to be freed upon Martha's death. Those too old or too young to care for themselves were to be supported by the estate. Those who needed education were to receive it. He had written the instruction himself, quietly, in the document that would not be read until after he was gone. It was not enough, but it was more than most men of his time and place had done. And it was done with a specificity that suggested he had thought about it for a very long time. He had been a man of his century, and his colony, and his class. He had also been something those things had not fully prepared him to be. He had been the man who stepped back, the man who made the Republic real by refusing to make himself permanent. The river at Mount Vernon runs still. The fields he walked are quiet in the winter mornings, the way they were on the 13th of December the last morning he rode out. The house stands at the edge of the bluff, looking south over the Potomac, and the water moves below it without pause. The way it moved when he was a young man on the Virginia frontier, the way it moved on the cold December night when the breathing in the upstairs room finally stopped. He had done what he came to do. He had made it possible. That was enough. That had always been enough. Suggest topics for new videos in the comments and subscribe to the channel. Sleep stories, Sleep Dream are released here every day,